what's up, everyone? Happy Friday. Thank you for joining us on this session of the Future Academy live stream. Today, we have a very special guest. We're talking to James Ramirez, who is a motion designer, a friend of mine, and who is the co director of the Spider-Verse main title sequence at the end. And I'm super stoked about this because one, that was a dope movie, and two, that was a dope title sequence. And so I've always wanted to know, what did it take for that thing to be made? What was the process behind it? And how did they get that very cool mixed media look that I think really stood out amongst all of the recent filmmaking and animation lately? So that's something that's just always stuck out to me. So I'm glad we can bring James onto the show. And I want to welcome all of you who are joining us live here. But if you could help me and welcome James Ramirez to the show.
Yeah, James, let's
Welcome,
go.
James, man.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. It's awesome to be on.
Yeah, I'm glad we can finally chat about this. And I saw some of the behind the scenes stuff that you've been leaking out over the past couple of I guess the past year. And I was like, dude, we got to have you on the show. This is so cool, and I know we're about to geek out on a bunch of things right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're definitely gonna have to try to control me as I meander through everything. But it's one of those things where it's like it was such a fun project, but it was also such like a crazy big scope. So there's like so much creative things to talk about, and it was such a journey that, I mean, it's fun to share that process because it's like my favorite project that I've ever worked on, and I'm really proud of it. And it's amazing when you can spend that amount of energy and love into something and then it also turns out good.
Right. And it's client work, because
Yeah.
sometimes these things are just personal projects, right? But it's fantastic when it lines up with client work and an IP, a piece of property that I'm sure you adore, because I'm a huge fan of Spider-Man.
Yeah,
Marvel.
yeah. It's that's always the trick, right? Is like finding that balance between getting to feel like you're making art for your clients. And it is a rare thing, I think, because a lot of times we're creative problem solvers, so you're just trying to help them get to that end thing. And this was a very special kind of relationship that I think there was a lot of trust. And I think when you trust in the process and the team, I think that the overall result of the film comes from all of the filmmakers at Sony trusting all of their team, and then by extension of that, the directors trusting us to like in their film, which was this like really big thing for them. So it's a good thing when all of those things can align and mix, and nobody feels like you're just like there's egos or stepping on, and it truly allows for like the creative to bloom.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's actually something that you could even see in the final work. I don't know why, it just feels like the final result that we all saw on screen just felt like it was oozing with creativity and love and passion. And you could just see that in the film because it was so fun. And it just, I'm glad to hear your perspective on it, because that definitely shows through. And I think why so many people have enjoyed this film and why it gained so much popularity when it came out.
Yeah, I've worked on several films, and every film is very unique and different, so they're all different productions, different teams, and they all vary in their creative process. And it's not like a formula, you can't apply one to another. But this one specifically, like every time we would see like an edit update or kind of dailies from them, what the visual effects team was doing, just everything felt like everyone is getting to be imaginative and breaking the mold and doing different things. And I think everyone had set out on that vision of doing something different, that no one was being told no, like that's not a good idea, or we're not going to do that. Everyone was like, well, let's just see where that goes. And I think when the film team is allowing that to happen, I think that's where a lot of that comes from. And so I think the response, it's one of the few films I think that you can actually stop on any frame, especially animated films. You can stop on any frame and it looks good.
Yes.
And that is very hard to do. Like, even if I go through my work, I'm like, oh, I want to like take some screenshots of this piece I did a while back.
Right.
It takes me so long to find like 3 frames I like. I like this one, that one. But this film, like, you could stop anywhere and it's just like, man, it's so well designed that the environments, the lighting, the textures, whatever it is, like, is just so spot on. And so I think that's why it resonates, because I think a lot of times you see film art books look better than the film. Like, it's like, oh man, those illustrators and all the designers they brought on were doing these amazing things, but it didn't carry to the final vision. And I think being able to lead the team, which the producers and directors were able to do on this to get to that final product, I think that's why it resonates so well.
Cool. Well, maybe for those of the people in the audience who might not be familiar with you or your work, I think it might be good to play your reel so that we could just get a sense of some of the work that you do, some of the stuff that you did on Spider-Verse, and then just so we have more context as we dive deeper into this conversation. So Jonah, maybe you want to cue that up?
Yep.
Yeah, and for this reel specifically, I was really kind of inspired by Media's take on reels, where she kind of really breaks down, she does so much design work and stuff. I thought that was a really interesting idea, and I wanted to embrace a lot of my creative thinking and problem solving in what I do.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an art director, usually I'm working on a team as kind of like a problem solver, and I'm usually trying to help either come up with techniques or visuals or designs that can help the team see things through. And so what I wanted to do was like show that behind all these pieces in a reel, there's a process, and there's iteration, and there's design that didn't make it, and there's a journey there. And so I wanted to try to build a reel around like that idea. And so really it's kind of a little bit of a different take on a reel besides just beauty stuff, but I think it kind of speaks to overall my approach to creative and kind of how I've gotten to where I have. I can really kind of put on a bunch of different hats. I've done design, I've done animation, I've done compositing, I've done drawing, I've done everything. So it's so helpful to kind of have that bird's eye view to approach projects and to be able to kind of slot in where needed. And so that's kind of like how I try to present my reel.
Yeah, no, I think that's a gorgeous reel, and it's people are saying in the chat, it's like super dope, bro. That's sick. But yeah, I think Nydia Diaz, who we had on the show before, she has an amazing reel. She's an amazing designer, and she kind of tinkers too, right? Like she does a lot of style frames and design, but then she'll do tiny experiments, all that lead up to the bigger conclusion, which is the final piece of work. And sometimes we don't see that, but sometimes that's the most interesting thing. When you can see the layers that build up towards something, sometimes those are more fascinating than the actual final piece. So I'm glad you shared that in your reel.
Yeah, I mean, there's often, like client, like we were saying, client work is often, it's never just one thing. So sometimes you're just doing very kind of dry, specific things, but you don't necessarily want to share that, or it's not that glorious to share. But still, that development I think is important. And over the years, I've taken that as like my main thing, is to constantly be learning, exploring, and kind of, my curiosity is kind of what drives me. So I like sharing that part of it, because that's what I find that's what keeps me going.
Man, that's rad. Okay, cool. Yeah, unfortunately, some people weren't able to hear our conversation during the reel when we were playing it, because I think the audio took over, but that's okay. Basically, the context for the reel was James was showing the final work as well as process work cut in throughout, and we were referencing a designer, Nydia Diaz, who was on our show previously, and her approach to reels. So we just thought that was a great way to showcase all of the things that James does, which he's been in the industry for a long time now. Longer than I have, and he's been problem solving all kinds of different things, and I think your background in design and animation and shooting and compositing and 3D, like all this stuff, it all adds up. And I think that's why we're here, and why you probably got this opportunity to work on something like Spider-Verse, where it is mixed media, multifaceted, and probably required a lot of problem solving.
Yeah, it's funny because like you know when the project came in and then we were gonna take it on, I like the thought that popped in my head was like I've been training like 10 years for this like because it's just like all of these very like different things in my life that could have been very unrelated. Like, you know, I used to do graffiti, so it's like Miles did graffiti, or you know, like it's like all of these elements that kind of come back to my voice and my design ideas that I wouldn't have necessarily. It's not like you could train for those sort of things to be like, oh yeah, you know, one day I'm going to need this knowledge.
Right.
It's like the stuff that just, you know, kind of comes naturally. So it was a process.
Oh, that's awesome.
I tried to create some slides to kind of show that journey, to kind of what that was like, since you're talking about that, like to like what that was to get there. So because I do think that that's like really important, right? Is like you're saying, so like as a starting point, you know, when I was younger, I got infatuated with the web, like I think a lot of people did, and I really got into web design. So again, to these things of like I was doing design centric things without understanding what they were or how they functioned as things. So in graffiti, you're doing typography, colors, composition. I just wasn't thinking of it that way. You know, dancing is like, you know, this is something you're very familiar with. You know, dancing is such a specific presentation, right? You're kind of putting yourself out there. You're going into the middle of a circle and you're either putting up or shutting up. You know, it's like very, very, there is no like people who just talk about being very good. It's just like you got on the floor and it's fun and that's what it is. And so there's all these things in my history that, you know, I kind of like got into web design and was doing Flash and stuff. And that took me to, I went to the Art Institute in Kansas City and I did a bachelor's in fine arts there.
And what year was this?
2001.
2001. All right. Damn.
And I basically my degree was in photography and new media, so it was a very kind of like vague thing. But we were doing, you know, it was like covering obviously photography, so traditional black and white and color, the printing processes, editing, but anything kind of computer related. And since I was doing kind of web design stuff, it just seemed like that was a place for me to go. And then when I was in college, I kind of got introduced to MK12, who was also based in Kansas City. And these things started clicking in my head of like, oh, I've been really interested in computers and then I'm really interested in art, but I didn't understand the two could be combined. So then it was like, oh, now I can do like design and like that's motion, and it's like, you know, using all of these things that I've been learning. And so I went and interned with them during my junior year, and subsequently in 2005 when I graduated, I got a full-time position with them, and I worked with them for almost 10 years.
Wow.
So MK12, you know, for those who haven't heard of them, were kind of early pioneers in the motion graphics days. And what's amazing about them is that they were they called themselves an artist collective. And I think that's very representative of the type of work that they did. So they were a group of artists who got together to make things move, and short films and filmmaking was at the center of what they wanted to accomplish. So there's a lot of things that I was absorbing from them that, you know, in hindsight, that I'm really appreciative, but I just didn't understand at the time because I was so green. I was new to this like career, but you know, I got to work on several films there. We worked on Quantum of Solace, Stranger Than Fiction, Kite Runner, and we worked on several like personal short films as well. History of America was a really big one that we did. And so it was this interesting like idea of learning all these bits about filmmaking, which wasn't in my kind of early growing up. Like there was nobody in my life who was like introducing me to films or talking to me about films. And so this idea of like filmmaking uh, that they instilled in me, and also they really embraced experiments and exploration. And so I think there's a lot of things that came out of there for me from that experience with them. And that was amazing. And then I ended up moving out to Royale. I ended up moving out to Los Angeles in 2014, and I got a staff position as an art director with Royale. And this was kind of like a big step in a different direction for me in a way, because I feel like the level of work that Royale was doing, the quality of it was, if MK12 was more kind of like MoGraph and like bashing things together and more DIY and kind of like cheating things, this was more of like kind of like a visual effects pipeline where it was proper compositing, and there was like teams. Like we had a staff, there was like designers and art directors and creative directors and compositors and modelers. And at MK12 there was like 9 of us just doing everything, and we didn't have titles. There wasn't like, I didn't even understand what a title was. Like they're coming, like I come out here to apply for the job and they're like, what was your title? And I'm like, they called me Delineator, which was this made up title that I had. It's like we kind of had these just random things attached to us. And I was like, I did all these things, but talking to them there, I realized I was like, that I had all of this knowledge that I didn't know other people out here, other freelance artists out here didn't have. So I had been on shoots. I had done green screen. I had, done photography. I knew what the entire production workflow was from start to finish. And I could kind of like talk to each part of it. Even if I wasn't like an expert at any of it, I still understood the flow of it and how things progressed. And that gave me such a big leg up into others that, were out here. And so, but it's just something I didn't realize. Like, I just didn't even know I had this knowledge until like there's a project at the top here that was for Nike Color Dry. And I specifically remember like there was a element shoot that was going to happen and nobody was going to go to it. And it was on a Saturday, and I just kind of volunteered. I wasn't staff yet. I was just freelancing. And I volunteered. I said, I'll go and, look at stuff. And they're like, oh, you want to go? It's on a Saturday. Are you okay with that? And I was like, yeah, it's fine. And I went, and the stuff that I was able to get out of the shoot was so much better than if no one had been there, because it was just people shooting things that they weren't creatives. They were just kind of like, hey, we're going to shoot some dust and we're going to throw some rocks and we're going to make some, it was an element shoot, but there was no one going that knew what it was for. Yeah. So there was things like that where they were like, wow, I mean, that was so cool that you did that and that you had that knowledge to be able to be informational and help. And so it was, things like that. So this was a big step in like learning, kind of like going from a very small studio of doing DIY things to a bigger studio of doing things kind of more proper. And I was there for 3 years, and it was, I think, the friendships and stuff that I met through there have stuck with me to this day. Like I've still talked to so many people. And then, I ended up going kind of freelance after 3 years. And that was kind of really scary to me because, for most of my career at this point, I had been staff, like 10 years at MK12 and then 3 at Royale. And it's like really short freelance stints in between. So going freelance out in LA was really scary to me, but I ended up kind of having enough connections and stuff that I landed at a small shop called Alma Mater. And it ended up being an amazing experience for me because it's a very small shop. It's like 3 people. It's Brian Ma, the creative director, James Anderson, who's a visual effects supervisor, 3D artist, and Ben Apley, the producer. And the level of work that they put out is really top notch. And, Brian comes from working at Imaginary Forces for almost 10 years and then starting his own shop. And so this was an amazing step for me in the sense where not only did it lead me to Spiderverse, but after kind of like freelancing and working with him for over a year, I really looked to him as like a mentor, where I was learning a lot about my voice in presenting decks, my voice in how I wouldn't call myself a designer, but he'd be like, you design, you're a designer. Or I wouldn't call myself whatever. And he would always be like, yeah, he saw the potential in me more than I did, or my skills more than I did. So I doubt myself a lot, right? As artists, we all do. And so it's been an amazing relationship because they've been very trusting of me, looking at the history of my work and letting me kind of like work with them in a way that I think is a bit different than most places who you freelance for. And so, this is like a kind of a smattering of things that I've worked on. Just like the neon stuff is from A Rough Night title sequence, and there's some MTV. Again, like not all this stuff is glamorous. Like there's some like MTV kind of, show stuff, reality TV stuff, or a Hoover vacuum commercial. And it's not that those are, or in this Venom wasn't even a project I won. It was just a pitch, but I was very proud to pitch. They let me pitch that project on my own and present in a way of like, hey, look, we're gonna, if you want to pitch on this project, we'll just back you up. You can do whatever you want. And so I presented for what felt like for the first time out of all of my past 13 years where I pitched on a project and it felt like my voice. I felt like I presented for the first time as like, hey, I'm James Ramirez. This is what I want to do. Here's my idea. There's no like extra frames in here that I don't want to make. There's no treatments in here that I don't want to do. It's one treatment. Do you like it? We're going to go for it. If not, that's cool. I put everything into it and it felt great. And then immediately following that, it was kind of like Spiderverse where, that landed at the studio as a pitch. And it was kind of the same thing where they, Brian told me like, look, we're going to pitch on this. I'm going to do a couple of treatments and you can do a treatment and you can just do whatever you want. And so that's a very empowering thing, right? Which it took, our work relationship of a year and a half to get to that point to where like, he trusted me, he respected me, and I trust and respect them for us to get to that point. And so
James, can I ask you a question right there about the trust? Because I mean, to have that opportunity is pretty fantastic, right? Yeah. Like pretty crazy. And you said, it took about a year and a half of you freelancing there and working on stuff. Do you think there's anything in particular that built that trust? Like if you were to summarize that, does there anything that comes to mind of like how you build trust? Because you've done that in the previous two shops that you're working at, and now here at Alma Mater, like it seems like you did the same thing. And I'm trying to ask on behalf of our audience, like if they want this opportunity, what are some of the things that they have to do to earn trust?
It's not like a 1, 2, 3, right? It's not that I don't know if it's like a repeatable thing that I could go back and do, but what I did was I showed that I had ambition to do each step of the process. So when I first started working with like Alma Mater, they brought me on as an After Effects animator. And then when they saw, they were like, oh, you're more than just like an animator. You have more. We'll let you chip in on some design. And then once they saw like, oh, you can do design, then it was kind of like, that's the hardest dance I think about freelance, right? Is that you can do a lot and what you can do, but when somebody brings you on new for the first time, they don't know what you can do. So they might be bringing you on because, there's a project that has type and you had a bunch of type in your reel. So they're bringing you on, but they don't know necessarily everything else you can do. So your job as an artist is to meet their expectations. You're like, okay, I'm going to do the thing that you brought me on for, but also look, you asked me for one version, I did 3 versions. And also you, we're using this type, but just in case you needed some more, I pulled some reference. So it's kind of just going a little bit extra and over to show that you're thinking about things and that you're processing it. And that you kind of have creative input. And now that creative input isn't, most places won't stifle that. Most places will welcome it and understand that a good idea can come from anywhere. But some places, you know, you're very specifically slotting into a pipeline. So sometimes it's not the best to try to introduce ideas if they're in the middle of a project and you're brought on to do something and you're like, well, hey, I thought of these other things. And they're like, that's great, but we're not there. So
or not looking for other ideas yet.
Yeah. Either. So you have to, you know, you have to read the room and you have to know where that is initiative is kind of like is going to get you somewhere and where that initiative isn't really warranted. But you know, that the trust that I built with Brian was through multiple kind of successful projects, you know, and again, there was a lot of in between stuff that wasn't glamorous, but it was being able to be self-sufficient and managing things on my own, but asking for help when I needed it.
Right.
And I think that's a big thing is like, you know, some people are scared to ask for help and they just want to say, yeah, I can do that, but you know, actually can't. And then it gets you in trouble because then you've set yourself up again with these expectations. You've set yourself up for something. And then if you fall short, then it's only you that looks bad. So
right.
I think those things are, you know, important. And, you know, that's something that I kind of like also learned through Royale that, you know, kind of ended up bugging me a lot, that it was a big life lesson was, you know, I worked with a lot of freelancers there, you know, because there was a lot of projects. And I remember specifically there was this Nike project that came in and there was a compositor who came in and it was me and him on the job, and a producer came in and said there's these changes that the client wants to do. And the guy was like, yeah, cool. Yeah, I can do that. We figure it out. No problem. And then the producer left and he was like, I don't know how to do that. And I was just like, why would you say that? Now I have to sit here and figure this out.
Oh gosh.
And so he put me in such an awkward position of like needing to research and figure something out to meet this expectations of him just saying, yeah, I know how to do this. And so, you know, that was a big lesson to me about when people aren't truthful about their capabilities. And I think as younger artists, again, like I think there's this kind of stigma that you don't want to ask questions or you don't want to ask too many questions. But I think more often than not, people are willing to help you if they have time, if you let them know that you need help. And if you flounder for too long on doing things that you don't know, and you've all suddenly wasted 3 days, 4 days of an important project schedule, then you've just made yourself look worse instead of just initially saying like, hey, I know you've asked me to do this thing, but I don't necessarily know how to do it, but hey, I will look into it and I will figure it out for you. But I just need, if it would normally take 1 day, I'm going to need 2 days or 3 days. And so I think once you start those dialogues and you're more honest about things, I think that's the type of thing that adds up over time into a fruitful relationship. So I think there's a lot of things that, you know, again, all of those things vary because every studio is different, every creative is different, every team is different. So you kind of have to figure out what works when and where. And, you know, if you're booked to do a 3D model somewhere and then your reel has a bunch of stuff from other, you know, things that you didn't do or something, you know, it's like this, again, those expectations of like, if they see a bunch of representation of things that they think you can do and then you get there and you can't do it, then you're just going to sour that relationship. And then also everything is kind of like a web and connected web, no pun intended. But it's like, you know, it's like every artist talks to each other and every producer talks to each other and everyone goes around and like your name goes around. And so these are things that you have to kind of work on constantly. And everyone's at different places in their life. So you never have to feel like ashamed of where you're at. Like everyone's been doing this for like shorter or longer than you. There's always going to be someone who knows more than you. There's always going to be someone who's more experienced than you. And it's just learning when to kind of be a sponge and absorb those things versus like trying to have an ego and think that you can do something the right way.
Right. Okay. So let me summarize that and we can move on to the next part of the presentation that you have. So really to build trust is you just have to have curiosity and ambition towards the things that you're working on every level, right? Because if you show that you care about all these steps, then people notice that. um, when you show up, over deliver, right? If they ask for one thing, show three. Show that you're critically thinking about something. You're not just doing the thing that they ask, but you're looking at it from different angles. Like, what are all the ways that I could solve this in better ways? And then just be totally honest, right? If you can't do something, say that you can't do something and ask for help. But if you could also step in and help, do that, right? And be helpful where you can. So these are all the things that I heard, and some things that I notice in qualities of other designers and artists that are also that have moved up in the ranks, or that I just find highly valuable and just a pleasure to work with. So I think these are actually common traits, and I thank you for sharing your story on that.
Yeah, thanks for summarizing it so elegantly.
Well, you say it once and I get to take the notes and then put it together, so that's why we're here.
Yeah. So I mean, to jump into like the meat and the potatoes, right? The fun stuff that we want to chat about is Spider-Verse. So again, to speak of relationships, just to kind of like set the stage is, Alma Mater had previously worked with Phil and Chris Lord Miller, who are the producers on this film. They had worked on previous films with them, so the Jump Street movies and the Lego movie, and simultaneously, actually, to this concurrent, they were doing the Lego movie 2 while we were doing this. And so it was again, it goes back to relationships where it was a trust thing. They came back to Alma Mater because they had presented good work in the past and had done good work with them. So they came to us and asked us if we wanted to work on this. It was kind of like a pitch or not sort of thing, where like we were the only ones. So we were going to lose to ourselves, basically like come up with something cool, or we'll just do it internally sort of idea.
There's more pressure on that when there's no one else to compete with. It's like, it's yours to lose. It's yours to lose.
So, but it's also like, by this point, I think maybe a trailer had been out for the movie. And so I was well aware of it. It looked cool. It had been in development already for a while before we got to, this point. And so that's the stage. So then we're invited to pitch. So we pitch. So I made this really bad slide that I tried to summarize like what this process was like. We basically kind of pitched. We then, they liked our ideas, and then we sat for a while, 2 or 3 months, and then they came back, and then we revised our pitch. We developed the narrative through storyboards, and revised our design, created, once you have the design, then you start creating animation. So then you have like an animatic and edit, and then you move towards your final. So it's trying to like neatly summarize everything, how it works, but really it's kind of like there's R&D and there's motion test happening, and then there's more motion test, and you're going back and forth, and then there's like an edit over here, but then you change that edit, and you're doing look dev, and you're freaking out. And the final, we also delivered in stereo. It was the first stereo project I had done.
Oh my gosh.
So it's like this is like the pretty way to dress it up. Right. How you think it went, but really it kind of was like a mess. So like I said, our pitch consisted of 3 directions. Brian presented 2 directions, and I presented this one. So at this point, when we're brought onto the project, we haven't seen the film. We've read, I think, the script at this point. So we kind of know like the story beats, and we know a little bit about what's going on. There's multiple spider people. There's a multiverse, and we're looking at exploring that. So my takeaway from this, which kind of stuck through the end, was, well, I should say that their overall kind of creative brief was to us like, is always like the make something cool, but it was in a sense of our film is going to be really cool and stylized. What our mission is to show a deconstructed comic book. So what is your take on that? How can you show a deconstructed comic book? So there's a lot to unpack there, right? There's the nature of an analog product where you have halftones and screen printing, overlaying colors, reduced color palette, typography, onomatopoeias. You're presenting heroic figures, poses, or whatever. So my instinct is to go immediately to the source. So I dove into all of the Miles Morales comic books that were out there. I just kind of like got a Marvel subscription on the iPad, and these days it's amazing that you can just kind of like do that and flick through all of this collection of comics that I didn't have. And not only to look at the story and to figure out what where this film was coming from, but also from a point of view stylistically, like what is Miles' world that's already been established out there. So it's looking at reference, and it's kind of looking at his character, but then it's also trying to start developing these design guides to move forward on. So like the thing that I wanted to convey in my treatment was reflection, was the thing that I stuck to. Was, well, two things. One is Miles is this kid who's into graffiti, so I wanted everything to have a very tactile, gritty feel to it. So there's a lot of spray paint in these. And the second thing is that these are all characters that are experiencing the same events, but in different worlds or dimensions. So the idea of reflection to me is like, so the idea that, like you could see one character in a world, and in the reflection, it would be another character. So the idea was that you could do this kind of continuous camera move and kind of move between their worlds, but they're all kind of experiencing the same thing. It's like the walk in my shoes sort of thing. So they all swing, they all run, they all land, but maybe they do it in different ways. So that was kind of the thing that I tried to convey in my design. And so I did it in a couple of things directly, like the city was mirrored and they were flipping. And then there's this kind of panel idea of trying to introduce panels, but comic book panels are very, kitsch. So you don't want to do it in a bad way. You want to try to elevate it and bring it into an interesting way. So I was trying to introduce panels that were interesting. And so this idea of like, again, like the reflection is by dividing a single city shot into multiple colors, and you're seeing a spider person in each different one, or a physical reflection as in the puddle. So this was my idea and treatment, and they liked this. And Brian's ideas that he presented were of similar nature, where they were very kind of graphical, reduced palette, very flat nature. So I think what the filmmakers kind of saw our take, and were really liking the idea that we were pushing towards something different and kind of more graphic. But again, they loved this deconstructed comic book, so the halftones and onomatopoeias being in space and speed lines and stuff. And so we move forward. They liked it. We went and got drinks afterwards. In the old days where you would go and do a presentation meeting in person,
right?
We looked at the deck in a room, presented it, and I was freaking out. And also this film, it was basically kind of like there was like 3 directors and then Phil and Chris. So it's kind of like you're presenting to like a big roster of people, and they're all like well established. It's like people that you're presenting to. It's Bob Persichetti, and Peter Ramsey, and Justin Thompson was the art director on the film. And so it's like all these kind of like big people have like their own like backgrounds and stuff. So it was scary, but they responded well. We went and got drinks afterwards, and then we chilled for a while, and then we kind of came back eventually. And as they were developing their film further, and by this time then we watched the film. So now we've kind of digested the world that they've created. And in the state that we watched the film, it's, I would say that, so like my favorite thing about this project period is that I got to peek behind the curtain and watch this film progress. And almost even more than like what we got to contribute, like that experience for me was like amazing to see this go from like napkin sketches and animatics and previs to like the final thing, and to see how they were developing things. So you're kind of constantly watching updated edits of where they're working on things, and to see little character changes that they would do, like, hey, we added in this dialogue or this shot so these characters connect more, or this makes the scene in Act 3 more powerful because you bond to these characters, or this happens, or this color palette. And so I love that idea. So that really changed my life, being able to see that process. And then I was also able to be in the room with a lot of these people, so it was amazing. But so we come back, back to this idea of like, we pitched and then we're going to revise our design. So they've started developing these moments in the film, which is this screen grab. This is not my artwork. This is from the film. Mm-hmm. And they call these burst cards. Mm-hmm. So what would happen is in the film, it would kind of pop for a frame or two to these mm-hmm. moments. Mm-hmm. And they've started really honing in on these. They love these. Like in their mind, if they could do their entire film like this, they would, but it's so mm-hmm. intense to do these moments because they're so designed and so kind of like graphic that they're hard to achieve. Mm-hmm. And so they basically communicated to us like, look, we love your design, we love what you've done, but we just want to integrate some of the things that we started exploring in these frames. So, as designers, I think Brian had a really good sense of how to deduce what they were speaking towards. And again, it's a limited color palette. It's back to this kind of analog feel of like you have big halftones and offsets, and speed lines are a big thing. The onomatopoeias are very integrated, and silhouette is important. So things are getting really reduced down. So even like, Miles becomes almost like two colors in this kind of train shot. And, it's just looking at those elements and kind of understanding how to like pull that back into our design. Mm-hmm. And so these are, I'm going to say these are like 80% Brian, and I helped out on some of these, but I think he was able to really go back and look at our design and help approach it through that lens.
Right.
So you can kind of see how we've really integrated the speed lines. They're very much an important part. The onomatopoeias are integrated kind of dynamically. The, Spider-Man, hero, Spider-Man here has been reduced to black, white, red. Almost his blue is almost completely gone. He has no logo on his chest. There's no web lines on him. Gwen, same thing. So, it's like taking those ideas that they were looking after and revising our set. So now it's like, okay, great. We're starting to figure it out. Here's a close up on with that. I think
these are rad. I gotta say, like the collaborative process, I think is pretty cool to see where your guys' initial ideas came in based off of the brief, and then you responding to some of the things that they were building in-house on the film, and then extracting a moment, which are these, you called them burst cards, which obviously just doesn't work for sustained moments for a long time. You can't watch 2 hours of that because you'll have a seizure. But, seeing something like this, it's like, it makes perfect sense for a main title sequence on the end. And it looks gorgeous. For some reason, it's just like it all came together. Even though you don't see any line work on Spider-Man here, you could tell his silhouette because of the distinct parts of his suit and armor, and then just like how the lines and the typography are layered in to still give you that sense of depth while everything is still flat. There's no shading, which is crazy to me, but it's so dynamic. So amazing results here.
Yeah. So, the thing that he was able to retain that we were able to figure out is also, this grit texture that's over the type and him is still from spray paint. So it's still a spray paint inspired element that is in there, but now it's just become a part of the design. Mm-hmm. And it's also like roughening all of the edges. I thought he was crazy for this. He would take like our like renders of the characters or whatever, and then just like run like roughen edges on it or something, you know what I mean? Right. Or dude like dissolve or something. And I was like, you're a crazy madman. But it gives this idea of imperfection, which goes back to the comic book analog idea, right? Mm-hmm. So and this is another frame that I did. And again, to like, I think the other thing that I think is funny about this sequence, again, from my point of view, is that I see this as the most basic thing that you could ever create in cinema. Like it's flat shading, it's standard shading. There's no specular highlights or anything. There's there's nothing fancy. It's no fancy renderer. It's just very basic rendering. And, like at this point, they had sent us a Spider-Man character, but I don't really know how to rig or do anything. So I like bent him really bad, and you can see his like deforming all in
Right.
his elbows really poorly. And, I'm sitting in a meeting showing this to like team at Sony who's working on this film, and it's amazing. And you've just taken their character and you've done this like really bad like
Right.
stuff on it. But again, it communicated what we needed to. It
Right.
communicated like, hey, we're gonna make a bright world. They're reduced in colors and things fall to halftone. And so, the halftone was another big point about this. So if you see like even like these speed lines falling to halftone, the the thing that is tricky about doing halftones is that halftones are, I don't want to say easy, but easy to do if you're in a MoGraph world where things are flat and you can cheat and it doesn't really matter. Our world was being done in cinema and it needed to be in stereo. So the interesting thing about halftones in stereo is just kind of like you're offsetting your images left and right to create the depth. So the further things are away from the camera, they get further apart, and the closer they are to the camera, they're more in focus. Well, when you take something like a halftone and you offset it, and a halftone is a uniform pattern, so it could just eventually line up with itself. So what it ends up doing is creating an unintentional flat of your design. So you're taking something, putting it in stereo, and then it just flattens back out in a way that breaks your brain and hurts your eyes and makes you want to vomit. So I say this from experience of constantly checking on a 3D TV and being like, the response you could tell when someone is looking at something bad on monitor, you just hear like, oh, like it's like guttural response to like, nope, that's not right. So that halftone, even though it seems like such an easy element of it, it took so like, I feel like during the entire process, that's one of the things that we researched the most, was halftones. Because you have to do it in a way to where it works in stereo and in 3D. So there's a lot that we did to think about that. But I point that out because like, these speed lines breaking up, if you just take a halftone texture, like you can see like this back one where I just did what anyone would probably do is you mat out a halftone by a silhouette. And what you get though is half cut dots. And that isn't really what a halftone would do.
Right. It's fake right there. If you're looking at the details, like that's not how a real halftone would look. And most people won't see that. But if you're really anal about it, or if you're the one studying it, it's like, I know what it's supposed to look like. So the imperfections matter and how things cut off matter. And I think those are the details make the difference. I always say that it's the difference between good and great. And the people that ignore these details are the ones that are making mediocre work, I think.
Well, so everyone who thinks, I mean, I'm a halftone snob now. So anytime I see it, I'm like, that's not right. But like these speed lines, to get it to do this was it's an involved process to figure it out. It's not just a straightforward thing. So even in, a lot of these designs, so like even in this frame, his hand over here basically falls to halftones and it's true to nature. And some of these are kind of just masked in. So it was a mixture, you kind of have to do a balance. We're trying to do this in a finite amount of time with a finite amount of resources. So you're trying to accomplish what you can and do it the best you can. So this is one where I have this in Photoshop. I'll just try to, so I had some of these other ones in Photoshop too, but let's go to that one. I don't know where that one is. So here's a different color of that same frame, right? But looking at, just this hand, if I like slow it down, like you can see that the actual silhouette is treated in a way to where the halftones do a true to nature of like the size changes instead of it just being masked. So it's kind of like going through the design and figuring out these things of how to layer and how to address the things that we're going to end up facing and compositing in finals. So a lot of the design was interesting because we were figuring out a formula to move forward with on our finals. So it was like learning how we were going to process the colors, where texture was going to go, how the edges get treated, how the letters are treated, the background, all of that. So that, that design process is important because it's figuring out what it's going to look like, but it's also helping inform the rest of the production as well.
For sure. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge some of our audience here. Dr. Phelps, he was looking at your Photoshop file. He's like, damn, the layers. And then, earlier, let's see, people were saying hashtag real ones. I think hearing your story, like a lot of people are resonating with that, and they understand, like a lot of the things you shared early on in your career about your insecurities, but also just being honest and truthful about what you represent and how you carry yourself in the industry. So I just wanted to acknowledge our audience who is tuning in live and as we're getting into these juicier moments of
So this journey basically, like kind of, I think the two important things to figure out for our production was how does it look and how does it animate. So we've done pretty good on the front of like, how does it look? We've done a ton of research. We've gotten there, and then we get to this point of like, how does it animate? And even kind of like in my original frames, I had always envisioned that. So first thing about being honest, right, is like in all of our original meetings, we knew our limited resources that we would have, and we said, all right, I said, for sure, you know what we're not doing is animating characters. I was like, I'm not animating Spider-Man. I was like, there's just no way that we could get that right. Like for how many different characters there are and how they move and all of that. I was like, we're not doing that. I was like, so the idea of like frozen moments will be very important to the sequence and extrapolating motion. And again, this idea of, like a deconstructed comic book, but also the idea of paying homage to a traditional animation. So thinking of like frame by frame animation and thinking of kind of like early devices like the zoetrope or this in the middle here is like Muybridge's early photography studies of motion, taking a lot of sequence frames to break down the actual motion of a horse. And I think, this was a test to actually, if they could learn if the feet all leave the ground at one point in time. So you kind of see that in the second frame. But then also looking back to the comic books, in the comic books, I've had explained to me before, like they're a very non-linear experience, and you can experience a page in any order you want. So you could go to the last panel, you could go to the first panel, and you could go however your eye is going to take you, but there's also a linear experience too, right? But what's interesting about that is like you have moments like this to where Miles is swinging in the city, but to help that story go along, they've shown him multiple times in a single frame. Or here too, like where he's Peter's jumping, and you kind of see a broken out sequence of him. So with the idea of me saying that we're not going to animate, we're going to do frozen moments, what that meant was initially telling Sony, like, look, for this, we're going to need your help. We're going to need to be collaborative, and we're going to need to get animated assets from you that will then bring into our sequence. So that was kind of, we said that out front, so that was good to have that out of the way, and everyone was on the same page, and they really came through. So I think that's an important, distinction to make in the sequences, that we were using their elements from the film and dissecting it and bringing it into our sequence and kind of adapting it as needed. So there's probably like a 50-50 mix of where 50% is coming from the film straight up, like shots from the film. And then there's another mixture of like where we needed custom specific poses and things that were related to our sequence. So this is kind of like an extrapolation of that idea. So here I have a scene. This is kind of like what I would get from them, which is Miles running. And if again, if you're familiar with the film, you've seen there's these sections in the film that are saying like, like telling their backstory, and they cut to their backstory. So this is where like this would come from. And
which one are we looking at?
We just see the PDF right now.
Is cinema not?
Oh yeah, I think you have to go to share screen and then change the program, or just share the whole desktop.
There you go.
Oh, there we go. Now we see it.
Oh, cinema was trying to not share with you guys. It's not my fault. So this is like a small Miles here, but from the camera, from the film of like, Miles is running. So this is what we would get from them. So it's an Olympic file, and it has all of the animation. So then what I would do is break this down into frames. So I would like, let's say, let's see here if I can just, I would collapse him down. So I would like go like, okay, that's a good frame. I'd go 2s or 4s and I would duplicate it and I would collapse him down and then move forward a little bit and then do it again, and say like, okay, I like that shot, and I would collapse him down. And basically you kind of end up building out a sequence of frames that are the animation.
Wow.
And so what then I would do is like, okay, now we have this like sequence of a character moving and we can kind of put him in our scene as necessary as we need. And kind of develop that for our shots. So, and again, to this being very basic stuff, I kind of thought of like the most basic way to do this was like, oh, so I've saved out each of these poses and I'll just drop those into a cloner. And the cloner will just duplicate them for infinity, like however many I want.
Right.
And then to go back to the idea of a, zoetrope is like, if you start animating the camera along this and you're moving fast enough,
right,
you get into the idea of a zoetrope. So
dude, that's tight.
And naturally, if you wanted to film this, you would, have like a black frame insert or something, so a flash, so that your eye can kind of see constant motion. But we're just we're treating like the frame rate and the kind of speed as our guide for this. So that the motion test that I showed to them in the state is a character that we've taken into Mixamo to do just a jump. So he looks really janky, but I've taken a cloner, I've replicated him, and I've treated it in different colors, which looks pretty ghetto and it's not that interesting, right? But what it does is illustrates conceptually, we're going to see different characters, it's going to be in different worlds, and this is the style of animation that we're thinking of. And this was enough to sell them on the idea, like they thought this worked really well. And so that this is in the process of figuring out how this stuff moves. And then the second thing that we showed was this test. So this is from an artist, Thomas McMahon, and he developed this test, and it worked really well. And what it is it's a visual trick. It's a mixture of single animations broken out, like I was saying, kind of in space, but it's also cloners to create reflections, and then there's also actual reflections. And so it's like if you imagine all this black space as a mirrored surface that we're not able really to see.
Oh my gosh.
So what ends up being created is kind of like this, very interesting fragmented experience of these characters. And this goes back to, my exploration again of my reflection thing kind of stuck through. So we're dealing with reflections. The multiverse in the film was represented through kind of like a spider web. So we've also been able to touch on that.
Right.
Just randomly. We didn't plan it. It just kind of happened that way.
It just hits all the things.
Yeah. And then what we realized is that if you added strokes or lines to the edges of this surface, that then also you create spider webs.
Right. Oh, shit, that's so cool.
So it's kind of like all of these things kind of coming together to make the whole. So our idea becomes like, okay, we've figured out how it looks. This is kind of our devices for how it moves. Our characters are duplicated in space and they're in shots, and then we're playing with reflections and that idea of the multiverse.
Dude, that's so sick. My brain is my brain is breaking. A lot of people in the chat are just like, "Oh, this is so interesting." Black says, "Genjutsu." Okay. This is from Naruto. If you ever watched that, it's pretty hilarious.
I haven't.
Anyway, keep going. This is so sick.
So again, like it's thinking of things as physical zoetropes and taking these poses and creating kaleidoscopic like effects out of it. Again, you know, and like that was the other rub with our designs is, you know, I was trying my hardest to avoid kaleidoscopes. I was like, kaleidoscopes are a very hard thing to design, and they've been done so many times. Like to do a fresh take on them is quite hard. So let's stay away from them. And then we did our whole second half of the sequence in kaleidoscopes. So that's how that goes. So I think, so I mean, these are just kind of quick times of the thing I was showing. So I don't think they're that interesting.
I don't know. You don't discount that, man. Like those are all pretty cool. Like all of these little motion tests, like we were saying when we saw in your reel, sometimes the process is more interesting than the final result. Because the final result, we see it and we're like, oh, that's rad. And then we stop thinking about it. But once you start peeling back the layers and say, oh, well, we did this because of this, and then this was an accident, but then this is what it led us to. Once you start seeing the creative thought process that went behind it, and then the trials and tribulations that got you to those things, you realize how much thinking went into it, how much effort went into it, and then how creative the final result actually is. So you get this new appreciation for it. So don't discount any of this stuff. If you have tons of it, just keep playing this, show us, because the audience is eating it up.
So you know, this is like an early exploration from one of the shots that we were doing in the film. And, you know, again, this is the idea of like, you know, kind of taking Thomas's initial motion test and exploring it a bit further, where we're transitioning from one character. And the idea was that we would, if I did one, kind of treating it like a, sorry, I didn't mean to click off there. If we treat it like a, action match cut, to where if all the characters in the camera move is doing the same between all the characters, we can cut between them and they would match. So it was kind of starting to explore that with one character, but exploring the multiverse of the lines and exploring the character treatment. And so, you know, it's kind of like all of these. So these are all things that are kind of simultaneously happening, you know, in my earlier graph of like how the things are trying to get figured out. And then I think I had, is there another? Oh, so this was just, again, seeing, so like taking their character, let me see if I can make this bigger, taking their character sequence, breaking it into frames, and then also taking their camera move from the film. So this is, you know, jumping off of the building that we see a lot throughout the film and exploring that in space. So this is what it looks like. So you also run into, like, you know, wanting to do shots like this, you're going to run into a lot of issues of stereo, where you can't have objects this close to camera. You have a character going through camera. So you're trying to figure out, you know, it's all these like things that are, the development process is answering a lot of questions as you're figuring out things. But it became interesting to see these echoes as like, you know, as a extrapolating this data in motion and bringing it out. So
so cool.
There's that, and let's see what is next in my presentation. Oh, so yeah, I mean, it's just kind of more looking at that kind of process. That's what that motion was. So this is what that same clip looks like from the side. So, I mean, just to stop for a second here on the amazing team at Sony. Me not being a character artist and learning a lot of things the hard way. I was very naive and I said, yeah, just give me, you know, the character from this shot and I'll put them in my shot. And what I didn't understand is that a lot of these, probably like, I'm going to say like 90% of these shots are bespoke to the camera. So everything is cheated and exaggerated to camera. So like what that means is, I wish I had a specific example of this. So like, you know, one example that I ended up running into is I asked for a sequence of Gwen swinging, and I brought it in, and it was meant to be seen from like a 3/4 of a wide camera. But when you rotate it around, what you saw was that her hand was going straight through her head. Right. So it's these things of like, they were like, you know, exaggerating proportions. And again, it's a comic book. Comic books aren't just like characters animated. They're like, everything is like foreshortened and cheated. So these character rigs that they had were doing all of this without you knowing it. So it looks right at camera, but if you were to rotate any degree, then it breaks. So the naive James is like, hey, we'll just get all these characters, we'll put them in these shots, and it'll all
Right.
work out. And then like they're like, yeah, you know, you can't do that. And it's like, oh, and they're also, so by the way, Noir is animated in a way that only his whole like cape and everything is hand animated. So they're like, if the cape, let's say like the framing is like this, and
Right.
you're seeing his midsection, they're like everything below is just static. So like
Right.
if you were to zoom out, his cape just it doesn't work, you know. Or
Right.
Ham is hand animated per frame regardless, because he's like a cartoony character. Penny is hand drawn and like,
Right.
you know, is a custom 2D rig. And you know, so there was like characters like Miles and, you know, Peter Burrito is what they called him, the
The
main
heavy one.
yeah. They called him Peter Burrito.
I love
And
that.
the, you know, those characters are kind of more traditional, so they kind
Mhm.
of had rigs that sort of worked, you could manipulate them, and they worked in space. But again, everything is being cheated to camera. So
Mhm.
in this kind of collaborative working relationship with them, I mean, we were so thankful that they were so open to sharing their files with us and their cameras with us, so we could use their cameras where it worked.
That's awesome.
So this is kind of like, I included this because this is like, again, part of this process of a lot of things going on behind the scenes, you know. While I'm, you know, kind of co-directing this with Brian, it's like I'm also managing all of the assets that are coming in from the client. You know, I think we probably had, I felt like a kid in a candy store. I think we had like, I don't know, 700 gigs of data from them that needed to be parsed, needed to be logged, needed to be categorized, needed to be accessible to artists. You know, everyone needed a quick way of being like, I need a Miles doing this, and I need to be able to grab that and also know where it's already being used or where it hasn't been used or what isn't being used. So we would get, you know, I would kind of create these sheets of data like this to where we're able to see what a shot is and what it looks like and what information is available into that. And also, we're talking about working with like Sony, and so Sony's all in their own pipeline and their own software, you know, whether they're Maya or whatever, like them sending us stuff and it happening to work in cinema is like luck, you know, like it just like honestly, like I want to go back to the scene real quick where I was showing the so like in showing this in the scene from them, if you can see like my object manager over here, you know, their characters would come in with like subdivision objects and all these different pieces and stuff. But luckily, I kind of worked it out with them somehow when they were exporting Olympics for us, that it came in with selection tags, which was amazing that it did that, because that's how we ended up texturing the characters. So we would, if I have another sequence, I think it's that. So, you know, basically we would create from, you know, based off of their original textures that they made for the characters, they kind of treated each character's body part as a separate map. It's a really smart way of creating really high fidelity maps for one character by breaking him into a ton of like UDIMs essentially. But we were able to like, you know, take advantage of that by just like having selection tags. So then I could isolate down shaders and we could create. So what was nice is I could create shaders that worked for a character and we could apply it to any character that came into us. So I could just grab it and apply it to another character. So it was nice that it was able to kind of have that flow, but it took a while to figure that out. And like I said, a luck that Olympics were coming in with these tags. Otherwise, I don't know what we would have done. It would have been a really nightmare to try to like rebuild all of this stuff.
Right. This might be over the head of some people, but it's just like basically we're trying to translate between different programs, and sometimes things don't translate. Luckily, this carried over, and he had the texture information that was consistent because of their pipeline, and he was able to use it across the board and in their final process. So a lot of luck, and then just figuring out the Lego pieces that you have to play with to put it together.
Yeah. So here's, so I have two scenes here that I just kind of wanted to dissect that I think are fun to kind of look at. So this one is the very end shot of us flying through a tunnel and finding Miles. So we basically start the sequence with Miles and end the sequence with Miles is kind of what we end up doing. And then we cut to the logo after this. And so this was, I have a scene for this that I think I'll open up and we can look at. And then the other shot that I have is this shot. So this is like the first this is the first opening shot, again with this is the start of the sequence. So this is that taking that run sequence and extrapolating it into like the zoetrope like moment. This is like the speed lines that we're seeing. And this is kind of like what the comped version looked like. So Renzo Reyes was the compositor on this project. And again, that Royale relationship, you know, luckily I had crossed paths with Renzo, and he had just gone freelance like right before this project was going to start. So I immediately stole him, and he is a huge like comic book Spider-Man fan, so it all kind of worked out.
He's in the chat right now. Earlier he said to name your layers, bro. Still joshing you, man. Still giving you a hard time.
it was so that was funny, as like, you know, Alma Mater had never worked with Renzo. Quick Renzo story. Alma Mater had never worked with Renzo, so they're trusting me. I'm like, hey, look, we're gonna bring on Renzo. He's the guy to do this. I know for a fact it's gonna be amazing. And they're like, well, I mean, you know, we've never worked with him. I don't know. And I was like, just trust me, bring him on. Renzo's there starting for like, you know, and he's working on stuff, and he's just so sassy to me. He's being so like, you know, he's being funny. He's being intentionally funny, just back talking and be like, no, or like, I don't know, whatever Renzo does.
Right.
And then like Brian's like, man, I thought he just like, I couldn't tell if he was being serious or not. I didn't know. Right. And I was just like, oh, we're fine. We understand each other. But we had built, again, back to this trust relationship, right? Where we built a secondhand, like we could talk to each other without talking to each other. So
right.
I trusted that he could carry these shots, excuse me, carry these shots to where they needed to be. And some of these had design frames, like you've seen, you know, like we looked at, some of them had design frames, and they're things that you can look at. And, you know, like there's a lot that we can pull from the design to build a shot like this. But something like the end frames, we didn't have design frames for, and he built it all somehow. And he got there, and it was one of those things where we didn't know what it was going to look like. And then I walked over one day and saw his updated motion test, and I was like, that's it. And I just had this like huge smile on my face, and I was like, we've figured it out. We figured out the end of our sequence.
Right. That's so cool.
But that's a breakdown of that. So this is, you know, this is kind of what we'll talk about. So this is kind of what I say when he figured it out. This is I kind of did like a time lapse where I took, well, let me show this first. Let's look at that shot that I was just talking about, and that's the opening. So that's what this shot looks like. You know, there's like a bunch of environment. There's some cans. There's Miles running across the train, and we have it ends in kind of transitioning to Peter Brito, and then it transitions to the next shot, kind of carries into Gwen, and then each character is kind of getting like elements from the design that were related to each. So Peter eats pizza when he's being brought in through the portal, so there's some pizza boxes and stuff in the background, and Miles with this graffiti. This is a train, but it's just set to a proxy, so it looks all blocky.
Right.
But so our take again with this, like being very simple, the idea was that we would render a very basic pass out color pass, and then just create a multitude of layers that we would bring into comp to match the aesthetic of the design. So by that, I mean that we would take each character, each environment object, and break them out into, we use the take system inside of Cinema 4D, which is really amazing because you can kind of render and you can set up tokens. Let's see if this is set up right. Oh yeah, so we had tokens, and it'll name it based on the layer and name on the take. And then we had, different, render presets that you could apply for each layer. So it was a way of like kind of breaking down each shot into a bunch of layers that we can composite with, and each layer would kind of get RGB mats or halftones or spray paint or speed lines. I think there's like a speed lines pass here. This is where, like you were talking about my computer earlier. We'll see how much my computer loves me shortly.
If we lose James, we'll know that he pushed his computer too hard. But this,
yeah. So this scene, that's kind of what this scene is. And I kind of accidentally stumbled into this. So I didn't, again, hindsight, I didn't archive all of these scenes properly, so I didn't collect them all with their assets, so I don't have all the beautiful textures for these, so we're just kind of looking at the versions that I do have. But this was an earlier version of this shot where so you can see all my pretty RGB on the spray cans there. But we kind of extended out. This shot doesn't do this anymore, but at one point it went from like Peter Burrito to Gwen, and then from Gwen to Noir.
Oh my god!
Which we kind of ended up changing how that sequence worked out, but it was kind of one long camera move. But you can kind of see how, that again at that kind of zoetrope motion really kind of was like successful. The other tricky thing, one more last tricky thing before we jump on the comping stuff was changing again back to the whole like stereo thing. I'm changing focal lengths here too, so I'm going from like a. Do I have?
Maybe it's like a 10 millimeter or something.
Well, so it goes from like a 24 to be wide, or maybe it's like wider, and then it pushes in to really tight, and then we're like pulling out again to be wide again. So it was like this like dramatic shift of a camera lens, and I was like afraid that it was going to make you feel gross, but it actually worked out in stereo. It wasn't bad. So I'm gonna close it. I'm gonna close this scene so that I can offload some of these. So
yeah, that's super cool. While we're doing that, I just want to acknowledge some people in the chat. Renzo says, thanks, man. It was all James. Kudos to him. I just click on things and stuff and it happens.
He's lying. He's lying.
Some people are curious, like, how long does something like this take to render? And I have my assumption that it actually doesn't take that long because of how you built it.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's so again, back to this like simplicity thing, right? Is because we're just flat shading and everything is really simple. These renders were really fast. And we were rendering at 2K, so it's like 2048 by 858, which is actually, we were rendering the actual letterbox image. So we were saving render time by not rendering above and below it. The only thing that honestly was really heavy render was the spider web lines reflections.
I see.
To get enough like reflection depth on that so that it looked nice. And the anti-aliasing had to be pumped up really high because it's really fine lines.
Right.
That was the one thing that we didn't really anticipate that kind of ran into kind of like some render. So everything rendered fast and it was really nice. But the reflection stuff took forever.
Because it's calculating every single bounce and then you just adjust for fidelity, right? How good is each reflection going to look? And that could get costly after
so here's a kind of like time lapse that I made of, like, speaking of all of those render passes, what that looks like. So this is like just turning on every single one as they're comped and then turning them back on as they were composited.
Oh my gosh. That's cool. Can you play that one more time? That's pretty rad. I think we had a few drop frames, but that's pretty rad.
So this is, this is our end result, right? So again, kind of like looking, so we had, there was like physical balls that we rendered through the reflections. This is kind of Renzo's idea to kind of do like, and like throw back to like the Kirby dots from like the comic books, and this is just, I don't know, Fresnel lines, our spider webs, our color pass of Miles, an outline pass of him, a halftone pass where he's basically treated with halftones in kind of like 3D that are being applied to his surface so that it moves with him. Spray paint texture, and then the environment kind of gets all the same thing where it gets halftones, it gets Fresnel, it gets different sized halftones, large, small, medium. There's our crazy like line pass that looks like webbing, noise, paper texture, more halftones, depth pass, all of the other ancillary all the ancillary character reflection, and then mats, because you have to cut out these characters. And this was kind of fun. We created the tunnel. We broke into RGB colors for each face of the tunnel. We figured out a procedural way to do this so that we could, again, thinking of each face as a different dimension for the characters so that we could bring in specific characters into specific faces, speed lines, and then it all kind of comes back together.
Wow, that's so cool. And I gotta First of all, like that's amazing work, but then also I'm also clapping for Renzo because if he was one of the main comp artists on this, like that's like 20 layers to play with, and then
he
to make sense of that.
he wasn't just the main comp artist. He was like he figured this out. Like, you know what I mean? Like this, he did this. He doesn't want to acknowledge himself, but I will. That was amazing. So
That's crazy.
this is what his comp looked like. This is not my comp, so I'm not responsible for this. If anything's not named, it's his fault.
That's his fault.
And so, like, you know, it looks all tidy and stuff, but, you know, like, again, I could kind of just we could go through and like turn off layers and you would just see, like, you know, the speed lines, the halftones. But really, you know, kind of the magic was, you know, using those RGB passes in an interesting way to combine all of these different elements and textures and layer them to where they felt like we were able to achieve a unique look.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's all the kind of stuff that we figured out in the design phase of the grit, the lines, the roughening of the edges, the, you know, reduced color palette. Brian was still so amazed that we were able to get away with like rendering the hero Spider-Man without his emblem on his chest. It's like it's a crazy thing to kind of take away from that character as like his main identifier.
Right.
So yeah, so that's what that looked like. And I think I mean, I have the scene for that, but again, it's like the same idea where it's just like it's just moving version of what we looked at.
Right.
And then I think the last quick time I have here, which again, this is something that, you know, I'll just need to share after, but it'll probably have a bunch of drop frames. But this is an interesting thing that I put together to try to show that same idea of that journey. This is like one of the very first tests that I did. We were trying to think of webs as a physical object, and if we could render characters as webs. This obviously got ditched very early on. We didn't do this, but it's just an exploration of that idea.
It's a fun thing that you could bring into something else, but that's expensive to render probably.
Yes, it was very expensive to render. But yeah, this kind of compares. I think I'll just kind of maybe just like scrub through this because it's easier with playback. But, you know, like you can kind of see like the various stages of like progression from like, you know, like our in sequence ending, you know, looking like this at some point and ending like this, you know, is trusting in the process, you know.
Wow.
And this was like, you know, I made all these like images for the there was a wallet and there are these awkward family photos.
Yeah.
And
I remember these these all stood out to me, so now I know who's responsible. Oh my god.
They were really funny to get in there. And I mean, this is like one of those things I probably shouldn't say, but it's like they're all based on like actual awkward family photos we found.
Yeah.
And so we had Sony was kind enough to endure our joke and matched all those Spider-Man poses to all of the photos, and it's amazing. Tight. But, you know, this is a great a breakdown of like, you know, being able to go from like, you know, storyboard thinking of like seeing sequential characters to seeing the animated noir of like him actually kind of moving as he would normally, but then breaking him down in our sequence to black and white. Again, trying to treat each character as a specific world and style. You can ignore my double up cards. But yeah, so I mean, this is just kind of like, it was like a nice way of like looking at this kind of breakdown of the process from start to finish of like some of these shots and seeing how they kind of progress to the final.
Wow. And,
you know, like, so, and this is probably, you know, so there's our wallet. This is probably my funny story too, is that the entire time they've been working on the sequence. I mean, we're getting like, I mean, I swear this is like 2 weeks out from delivery. We had been showing the edit the entire time without a logo at the end. It just cut to like a black box or something.
Right.
And at one point they were finally like, when are we going to see the logo? And I hadn't thought about it. I was just like, it wasn't on my mind. To me, it was a thing that was solved. It was like, oh, right. You just cut to a logo. It's fine. You don't worry about it.
Right.
And then it turned into this huge like ordeal at the last minute of like trying to figure out what this logo was and how it moved and how it introduced. And, you know, I thought we were just going to take their poster art and, you know, put it on the end of the film, but they actually, it turned out they didn't like their poster art. Like not that they didn't like it, they just wanted to do something unique for the film. So we ended up working with their team to kind of create this more stenciled, painted, painterly look. But it was really pretty funny to work on a main title sequence and to forget to work on the main title until the very end of the project. And I don't necessarily know how I got away with that, but it all worked out somehow.
I think that's in the hands of any skilled designer or artist. We make it work, right? That's our job. That's our job.
So yeah, I mean, sorry, I know that's like really long-winded, and I feel like there's a lot of the process that, you know, I probably skipped or forgot or jumped around a lot. But I mean, it was such a, you know, to me, the monumental challenge was I was being put in a role that I specifically, I'm going to say that I went in just thinking I was going to be art director. Brian was very kind, and at the end of the film, like we were like, I don't know, sending it to South by or something, and he added on the credits as me as co-director, and I was like, what? I was co-director? And he's like, yeah. I was like, oh, cool. But it, you know, it was this role that I had never really kind of filled before, and it was a big task. You know, there was a lot of scheduling, there was a lot of figuring out how to get stuff done in time, there was a lot of, you know, revisions, and I learned a lot about my creative process too. I want to be a creative, where I walk this line with my team to where I don't want to stifle ideas. You know, I want ideas to flourish, and I want people to come up with ideas. And I think everyone should be able to offer ideas, and that process should be very fluid. And I think there's this balance between giving a structure and giving strong direction versus like forcing people to just kind of pixel push your direction, you know, like you want people to feel like they can kind of bring something to it. So I think part of early on in the process, maybe I was a little too fluid in hindsight, where I wasn't giving a lot of direction, but it was also from this almost, this insecurity again about, you know, me not feeling like I had the best thing to say. But, you know, what ended up happening a lot, honestly, was kind of like a big surprise to me, was I would do these kind of various motion tests, like that one of like in the tunnel with the reflecting Spider-Man characters I showed you earlier on with the green screen thing. There was all these motion tests that I made that I ended up like, you know, I would cut out of the conform as I was building, and then Brian would be like, where are those shots you made? And I was like, oh, they were just tests. They weren't like meant for this. And he's like, no, just put that in there and just do that. That's already done. Just do that. And so like, there's a lot of convincing of me, you know, him to me of just like having confidence in what I was making. But it was amazing from like his point of view. I learned a lot from him about, you know, the overall story. He was so instrumental in making sure that the narrative carried from point A to B, which I didn't really talk a lot about the narrative. I kind of was diving into the technical and the developmental process, but you know, that narrative is kind of introducing the characters, their worlds, mingling those characters, and then kind of getting into the multiverse through the absurdity, as Phil would say, of that multiverse. Since we've, you know, where the sequence comes at also at the end of this film is you've just experienced Act 3, which is the most intense, crazy visual treat ever, right? Like that Act 3 is so intense. So coming out of that into a sequence that feels like you can kind of catch a breath but still kind of have some of that energy was a really challenging thing to do. And, you know, you're basically cutting a music video, and once you have, you know, a music track, you're trying to pace it to that and adjust that narrative. So there's a lot of things that we were working on constantly and honing it in. So there was a lot of moments of, I don't want to say aimlessness, but kind of exploration and kind of opening it up. And so to some people that can feel drowning. And so I never wanted my team to feel like that I was leaving them out to just drown. I just wanted to leave room for people to speak up, but also still give enough strength to it. So Brian really helped shape the overall narrative of the piece and carry it through, and trusted me to help bring that vision to life. And so it was a true testament to everything that I like to do. I like to design, I like to explore, I like to creative problem solve. And I feel like, again, for the first time, I feel like I had a piece that was genuinely me. That made it to a feature film, like I can watch that sequence and I can feel like my fingerprints are on it. And there's not a lot of work that outside of my personal stuff that I feel that way about, like I don't mean this in a way to sound negative or mean or anything, but I can look back at my Royale work and I could say, you could remove me from any of those projects and you would never know I was on them.
Right.
From my point of view.
Right.
I understand maybe I was instrumental in helping something or figure something out or this or that. But to me, you couldn't look at that work and be like, oh, James was involved with that, because it's a shiny shoe render and it, it's in a whatever, it's photoreal. And even if it's just not technique, but it's taken me, a long while to feel confident in what I can do, and understanding that collaboration is the true nature of what I enjoy. So what I seek these days is a very simple motto, and it's just that I want to make cool shit with cool people. That's it. It's such a simple distillation of everything that I want to do. Because like I said, not everything's gonna be glamorous, not everything's gonna be portfolio worthy, and you have to enjoy the process and enjoy what you're making. And then to the young people too, the thing that takes a while to learn is you have to separate yourself from your work as well. And that's a hard thing to do too, because sometimes we get so personally attached to what we're making that we think that if what we made fails, that we have failed. And that's not necessarily true, especially in client work. It's just not right for the brand or client or idea. And so there's this constant battle as an artist to be proud of what you're doing and be fulfilled by it, but also remember that you can remove yourself and be fulfilled by all of the things that added to my character to be able to work on this: the breakdancing, the graffiti, the web design, the whatever, the video games. All of that stuff feeds into this. And so I'm glad that I do all of those things outside of work to feel like, that adds up to this moment and to keep growing,
No, that's rad. Yeah, really. Thank you, James, for sharing all of that, for your journey to get to this point and your honesty of showing, it's like maybe you weren't that confident in your skills, and even up until this last massive, amazing project. And, sometimes it just takes the right person to extract that out of you, the right conversation, the right mentor, the right person to just say, no, man, you're amazing. And I'm hoping that having more conversations like this, like what we're talking about right now, just is a kinder, more honest reflection of who you are, because you're pretty amazing. And you're just this kind, talented person that I've been fortunate enough to know, and everybody here on the stream has been able to learn a little bit better. So I thank you for sharing those messages, and I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with that. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience that maybe if you guys have anything that you want to ask James, go ahead and drop it in the chat. But I think you covered quite a bit, because there was some questions early on about your early career, but I think you just kind of encapsulated a lot of that in your closing there. So if anyone else has a question, feel free to just ask before we let James go.
I did see one previously early on that said, it's from Flo. What advice would you give to someone that wants to be a movie title designer?
That's often a question I'm asked because I've happened to work on some title sequences, but like my story says, I never set out to work on this stuff. It just kind of happened. So I always tell people, put out the work out there that you want to make. No one's going to hire you for things that they're not seeing you make. So just build your own personal work of the things you want to do. And when people see that, they'll, think of you. So that's the easiest way. The other way is, the more direct way is like, try to work and collaborate, freelance, whatever, with the shops that are working in titles that you like their work. If somebody inspires you that's doing title design, go hit them up and try to, get in with them. And that's going to be your best route,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the best advice. Chris gives it all the time. It's like if you want to work in a particular industry or studio, go look at that studio's work, and then close the gap between your portfolio and theirs. It's like
Yeah.
if you want to work at a place like Elastic who does high end 3D stuff, guess what? You have to be good at high end 3D stuff. It's like as
Yeah.
simple as that, and then you just show up. And be persistent, and then you'll start working on that stuff. So, luckily for you, I think you grew up and came up in a time where motion was still kind of finding its legs, and it was very mixed media early on, right? And
Yeah.
you got your hand in many things like live action, 2D, 3D, and then bringing in obviously your own angle and experience and all of that. So that's pretty fantastic to be able to have all those things and brought you to where you are.
Yeah. I'm very fortunate to have the journey I did. I try to not plan things out, and I try to just let it kind of, the road goes where it goes, and I'm going to follow along and try to not get upset when there's a bump or it doesn't go the way I plan. And just try to, and you just try to go with it and figure out what to do. And I think as long as you're enjoying it, you're going to find work. And so you just have to make sure to present the stuff you want to do. If you fill your portfolio site or your Instagram or whatever with a bunch of one thing, guess what? That's what people are going to think you do. So that's what you're going to do. And so, right. But I also think, again, back to this whole, like, everyone's in different experiences. So like, you could want to just do Nike spots, and then you realize after a year of it that you're tired of shoe spots. And so it's like you learn what you want to do next. And so you kind of learn through experience of what is kind of hitting that itch for you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Yeah, you could get tired of something and you could always change direction. That's the beautiful thing, right?
Yeah.
As a creative, you get to explore. It's important to go deep and exhaust the well until you're just like, you know what? Now what? Right? Because now you can add some new skills. You can explore some new things, which I see you're constantly doing. There is a question here from Jewel Many in the chat. This person says, do you always prefer designing in 2D first before you jump into 3D? Or do you just sometimes just jump into cinema right away to flesh out an idea?
It's a good question. I think there is not one approach that I take. I just take the approach that whatever gets it done. So I don't prefer any sort of software over another. I'll open whatever software it takes, or I'll open whatever, gets the idea out. So sometimes it's there's two parts. There's two parts to this that I think is my design conundrum that I try to avoid. One comes from like working at a small shop like MK12, is anytime you design something, you needed to know how to make it. Mm-hmm. So I would always make sure that I could make it if I was going to present it. And sometimes that's limiting though, because you could eliminate a really good idea just because you technically don't know how to do it, when you could hire somebody to step in and help you with that. Mm-hmm. Say you had a really great idea that did water stuff or Sims or something, and you didn't know how to do that. Well, instead of just excluding that idea that, in the presentation they could really like that idea, you could just represent it in a way to where that you can find outsource it and get that accomplished. So sometimes it is good as a means of knowing that you can produce it, of making it in cinema or make it in Photoshop, whatever works. But sometimes I say just go into Photoshop and don't limit yourself, and just don't worry about necessarily technically how it's going to be made, but just make things,
Right. And I think that comes with exploration. The more you get to do exploration, like on the nights and weekends and whenever you just have free time to just explore either new software, new techniques, those become tools that you can approach other problems for in the future. And you don't necessarily need to know it at an expert level, but if you know a little bit about it, what you can do is you can start to say, it could be a little bit of this, it could be a little bit of this, and I'm very knowledge in this thing. So if I take my core skill and then sprinkle in these other two things, and it kind of looks like it might work, right? Like your motion test. And we do this all the time in the motion design industry. Then once the pitch is won, once somebody buys the idea, then you just hire the experts in those two other categories. And it's like, now let's do this. Let me let's bring the Renzo in to make this actually happen, right?
Yeah. No, I that's a very great way of putting it. I always think of like, all of my experiments that I'm doing at night. I do a lot of like personal exploration of, particles or After Effects stuff, or I do a lot of VR. And it's not necessarily that I'm thinking of like these things are useful towards anything. I love having this toolbox for when you come to a problem, you'd be like, oh, actually, you know what? A year ago, I made this project that did just this thing. So if I
Mm-hmm.
just take that and tweak it, it'll work for this. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of that ideas that are just kind of like, um, stacks, they just kind of like layer up in your building folders,
Mm-hmm.
and it all kind of like culminates to great ideas.
That's it's so fun. It's so fun. Okay. There's one last question here that I want to ask before we wrap up. And this one's from Altsumi. It says, "Hi, I've just started studying graphic design and I'm interested in motion graphics. Just wondering, how long did it take you to go from that beginner stage to being at a level where people could actually hire you?"
Interesting. um, I don't know. That's really tricky because I wasn't, when I got into like web design and Flash and stuff, I wasn't really learning with the idea of trying to get a job. I was just doing stuff. So there's a lot of knowledge that I built up before I was actually trying to get into the career of getting hired. So I feel like my journey is so weird that I don't know the actual like how to like phrase that experience. But I feel like it's just kind of, keeping your head down into it and learning it, and then what you just want to like learn the basics so that you can kind of work in that production environment. And again, to this idea of like, you're trying to learn towards your goal of where you're trying to work, so you just want to make sure that you're learning what those fields require, what your responsibilities would be as an artist, and kind of honing in that, like if you're trying to learn After Effects, you don't necessarily need to know how to do like character rigging in After Effects. You could learn how to
Mm-hmm.
do really great typography, or you could really learn how to do great compositing. Like it's such a versatile tool that I would highly suggest kind of just picking a couple of things to focus on and get good at those, and then branch out from there.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you just try to learn everything at once, you're gonna overwhelm yourself, and then kind of feel like you don't know enough. So I think that's probably the best approach.
Yeah, I agree, and everybody has I think part of it is ambition and hard work, and then the other part is just luck, right? You were in Kansas, you went to school there, and MK12 happened to be in your backyard, and I mean, that's not to discount your work, but you were at the right place at the right
Yeah.
time with the right attitude. So I think all of those things, we can't discount the luck that we all have, the fortune that we all have, but at the same time, it's like some of that you can definitely manufacture, and a lot of it you can just through sheer will make it happen.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean there was no like I think of myself as being in the right circumstances at the right time, and I know it's like you never want to discount hard work by saying luck, but
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of my path that just kind of found itself, and it was
Mm-hmm.
unplanned. I was from a really small town in Texas, and there was no one in my family had gone to college before, and there was no reason for my mom to say, "Yeah, you can go to art school," when no one. It's not like she said, "What are you gonna do? How are you gonna get a job using that?" Or like, there was none of that. It just was like okay, and you're gonna go move there all by yourself. You don't have any family there, okay, and like we don't know how we're financially gonna do that, okay, and it was just like it just kind of went and happened, and so and I think there's a lot in my career where I happen to be surrounded by people. Like I kind of said, it's about Brian, but it was also like at MK12 where they saw
Mm-hmm.
the possibilities in me that I
Mm-hmm.
didn't see.
Yes.
so,
Oh,
so,
yeah.
so they saw that I was willing to kind of put in the hard work and that I could learn. And even though I didn't, fully know what I was doing at the time or have the best sense of it, it was the fact that I had that ambition and the fact that I was willing to do that and put in that work, and that they could see it, that that kind of just kept evolving me and giving me opportunities to grow.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much, James, for sharing that. You can find more of James at friedpixels.com and at friedpixels on both Twitter and Instagram. Check out his Instagram because he posts all kinds of dope experiments there almost daily. Like he's posting crazy stuff that you could see where his mind explores, and then probably a few months from now you'll see him working on some crazy project that's a result of all those experiments. So follow him there. He's good people. And James, thank you so much for being generous with your time and your process here. And I know we all learned a lot, and I personally geeked out quite a bit.
Oh yeah, I mean, thanks so much for having me. I mean, it's a pleasure, and I don't want to. I never want to state working on that film like it was a single person thing. It was like a team, and it's a big collaboration amongst a lot of people. And so, yeah, I'm very honored to be able to talk about it and share our experience. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Cool. Jonah, can you take us out?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We will see you on the next episode.